No one really loves change. It's a pretty universally uncomfortable process, but life is also full of change, and there are so many times where we want to create positive change in our lives, in our work, in our community, organizations more broadly. So, how do we make that experience less unpleasant for ourselves and for others so that we can manage the inevitable change that life brings while also creating really positive changes for ourselves and others? That's what we're going to talk about today. If you're new here, hi, I'm Kara, and this channel is about human connection and navigating change in your life, in organizations, and more broadly for collective well-being. Now, change can be hard. It usually is quite challenging, but not all change is created equal. I like to think of change in two broad categories. One is change that's imposed on us. So that might look like losing a job, losing a loved one, going through an org restructure, going through a divorce, natural disaster, conflict. This is something that while we may have had some influence on it, say losing a job or a relationship ending, in general, it feels that it's out of our control. It's something that happens outside of us that we need to manage and adapt to ourselves. Then the other category of change is something that we've initiated, such as changing career, moving city or country, starting a business or selling a business or leaving a relationship, getting a dog, changing your eating habits. These are all changes that are initiated ourselves. So they're not all created the same, and in general, changes that you initiate are easier to adapt to and manage than changes that are imposed on us from the outside. They can be a bit harder to adapt to, but both are possible to adapt to. Obviously, we're human being, very resilient people, but in general, one can be harder than the other. And understanding this change process is really helpful to navigate both of those, because ultimately, although they can be quite different experiences, the change process itself, what goes on internally, is quite similar. The change curve was developed by Swiss American psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and you probably, or you might recognize this as the grief curve, and you'd be right, it's the same thing, but it's also what happens inside of us when we go through change. So in the first section, in the first phase, there's this sense of shock and denial. Now, this will mostly happen in cases where the change comes from the outside, it's change that's imposed upon us. This one is so much less potent when it's change that you've initiated yourself. So in this shock and denial phase, you might feel numb, as if the change hasn't sunk in yet. And it's that really first initial shock. The next phase might be anger and frustration, possibly also resentment and blame towards those who've made a change that affects you. It might be more focused on the frustration side of things if it is change that you've initiated yourself. The next stage can be depression, feeling sad, lost, or heavy as reality sets in. And then an acceptance, where you come to terms with the change, you experiment with ways to move forward and feel a commitment to the next chapter. And this is the part and the time where you integrate this change a bit more. So this curve can seem quite straightforward and simple pathway, but it's really just a set of phases that everyone experiences quite differently anyway. So it's good to understand the phases and to be able to understand maybe or to identify where you might be sitting at any one point. But it's super important to remember that everyone experiences this differently. You might not experience every stage, and you might experience stages at different levels of intensity. And also, it's not linear. You don't just go start, finish. You can get stuck looping between stages, so you can come out and then go back down again, especially between acceptance and anger. But being aware of this can really help you notice if that is happening, which will then be able to, just this awareness in itself can help ease you out of that as well to move forward more smoothly. And as I sort of hinted at before, self-initiated change, such as moving career, moving country, the changes that you choose for yourself, have a little bit of a difference here in that you might skip the first few stages because it's not imposed on you. But it might feel like you're skipping the first few phases, but those phases might have actually still been there to a lesser extent, but were part of your processing period for deciding to make the change. So by the time you actually decide to take the leap, you may have already gone through the phases of, say, shock and realization and frustration in the process of realizing that you can't stand your job as a legal secretary, and then get angry at how boring you find your day to day until you finally leave to fulfill your childhood dream of becoming a zoologist, right? So you can maybe have gone through the shock, denial, frustration, anger before actually deciding to make or to take action on that change if it's a self-initiated change. But a lot of the time that still is the curve. You're going through those phases to some extent a lot of the time. But you still, as I mentioned, can skip phases too. So it's really important to understand that this is a very normal human response to change, and it's really helpful to identify where you are in the process and what you can do to support yourself through it, because what you're going to need at the shock and denial phase is going to be super different to what you need when you're frustrated or, say, in the depression phase, or looking to start experimenting and coming out into acceptance. And noting that, especially with big change like grief, that circle is very normal to loop back in and through. Although over time, hopefully, it's quicker and easier to come out the other side. So I hope that you can take this tool and just understand a little, or be able to reflect a little bit to understand where you might be in a change, but also where, if you manage team or you're experiencing change with close friends or close family, to be able to be aware of where others might be in that change curve, because again, what people need is really different at each point in time. And to understand for yourself what you need at each point in time. And this is one of my favorite questions that I love giving people to ask, or to asking other people, but also to get people to ask for themselves. Which is, it's so straightforward and so simple, but also just something that I never grew up asking and learned it maybe in my 20s. And I think that it's such a powerful tool to just reconnect with yourself and cater to your needs in any moment, especially when you're going through stress and overwhelm, to just reground and then be able to go forward again. And that question is just, what do I need right now? And to just ask yourself, okay, what do I need in this moment? And what do I need in this phase of the change is going to be really, really important to being able to hold yourself through a period of change. Because rather than powering through it and just trying to white knuckle your way through it, actually processing through this change curve and processing the emotions that come up through it is going to help you move through so much more easily with so much less suffering than if you just try and block everything out and power on as well. So this tool is really important to keep in mind if you're leading change for others, to be able to reflect on where you're at and where parts of your team are at, so that you can provide resources and tools for them to move more smoothly through the change, but also so you can look after yourself through phases of change as well. So I'd love to hear if you've ever applied this in your life or your work, just to understand where you're at, and I hope that you're able to use it moving forward. Thanks so much for joining in, and I'll see you again soon.